They fought without muskets, but their war was just as fierce. While the men marched beneath banners and drums, women waged a quieter battle, one fought with calloused hands, sleepless nights, and unyielding hearts. Their names were never written in the dispatches, their faces never carved in marble. Yet without them, the revolution would have starved, frozen, and fallen. They were the invisible army, the ones who fed freedom before it ever learned to fight for itself. Across the colonies, the revolution did not begin on battlefields, but in kitchens and fields. Smoke rose from hearths where women boiled meager rations into meals for entire regiments. In the dawn's chill, they mended uniforms with fingers stiff from cold, while children clung to their skirts. On distant farms, widows drove plows through frozen soil, praying the harvest would come before hunger did. War was not a faraway struggle. It was a shadow that crept through every home, demanding strength from those who had nothing left to give. At Valley Forge, the soldiers' suffering was legendary, but behind the legend stood women who refused to let them die. They nursed frostbitten hands, patched torn boots, and buried the dead. Some followed the army wherever it went, hauling wagons, washing clothes, and enduring the same marches and hunger. They were wives, daughters, and mothers who traded the safety of home for the terror of war. When bullets flew, they ran water to the wounded. When rations ran out, they scavenged what they could. They didn't fight for glory, they fought because someone had to keep the world from collapsing. Each of them carried a story history never bothered to write. There was no record of the woman who lifted a fallen soldier's head as he gasped his last breath, or of the mother who sold her wedding ring to buy grain for the winter. No one recorded the names of the women who walked barefoot behind the army, children in tow, praying that liberty, whatever that meant, would be worth the pain. They were not heroes in the eyes of their time, they were survivors. Yet it was their survival that kept the dream of independence alive. When the fighting ended, no medals were given, no songs were sung for them. They returned to homes that were gone, to husbands who never came back, to lives that had been rewritten by sacrifice. But the strength they left behind lingered in the families they rebuilt, the lessons they taught, the resilience that became the heartbeat of a nation. The revolution's victory rested not on the shoulders of generals, but on the backs of women who history never meant to remember. They fought in silence, and that silence became their legacy. Their courage did not shout, it endured. And though their names were lost to time, their strength became the invisible foundation of freedom itself. Before revolution spilled blood, it spilled tea. Long before the thunder of cannon or the march of armies, rebellion began in the quiet rhythm of women's work, the hum of spinning wheels, the scrape of looms, the boiling of kettles left empty in defiance. The daughters of liberty, as they came to be called, were not soldiers, yet they wielded power no army could match. They struck at the empire not with bullets, but with refusal, refusing to buy, refusing to bow, refusing to be silent. In the years after the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, Britain's taxes reached into every colonial home, into the fabric of dresses, the sweetness of tea, the daily comforts that defined life. But when Parliament demanded obedience, it was the women who answered with fire in their voices. In kitchens and meeting houses from Boston to Charleston, they gathered to pledge their defiance. They brewed herbal teas from mint and raspberry leaves, spun homespun cloth from rough wool, and swore never again to wear the empire's finery. Every stitch, every sip, every sacrifice was a declaration, we will not pay for our own chains. For many, it was the first taste of power. Housewives and daughters who had never spoken in public suddenly found themselves at the heart of protest. They organized spinning bees, turning domestic chores into acts of resistance. They wrote poems, signed petitions, and shamed those who betrayed the cause by drinking imported tea. The revolution's first armies marched with muskets, but these women fought with needles and words, transforming the most ordinary tasks into a language of defiance. Their courage was not without risk. The British mocked them as unladylike, as troublemakers. Loyalists called them traitors to their husbands and their king. Yet still they gathered in barns, parlours and churchyards, spinning, weaving and whispering about freedom. Some of them never saw the war's end. but their work clothed the soldiers who did. They were the lifeblood of resistance, the proof that liberty was not just a man's dream, but a people's duty. In time, their influence reached even the men who claimed to lead the revolution. Samuel Adams and others praised the Daughters of Liberty, calling their example more persuasive than any speech in Congress. And they were right. Every homespun dress and every empty teacup became a symbol of what independence could mean, a life made by one's own hands, not dictated by a distant power. The first rebellion of the revolution did not begin with a musket's crack or a flag raised high. It began with women's hands, spinning, stirring, creating, refusing. In the soft glow of firelight, in the silence of their homes, they turned labor into protest, and protest into revolution. Before the colonies learned to fight with weapons, they learned to fight with will, and it was the Daughters of Liberty who taught them how. While men debated freedom, she demanded they remember the ladies. In a world where women were expected to keep silent, Abigail Adams dared to speak, and her words still echo across the centuries. She was no soldier, yet her pen fought its own war. One for equality, reason, and dignity in a nation still learning what freedom meant. While her husband helped design a republic, she reminded him that liberty without justice was only another form of tyranny. As war and distance stretched between them, the letters between Abigail and John Adams became a lifeline, part love story, part philosophy, part warning. From her farm in Braintree, she wrote of lonely nights, sick children, and the constant threat of British invasion. But beneath the domestic worries ran something deeper, the belief that this revolution could remake more than government, it could remake society itself. When John wrote of independence, she replied with conviction, "Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." Her voice was calm, but her ideas were radical. In a time when women were legally invisible, their property, wages, and even their words belonging to men, Abigail dared to demand representation. She believed that if the colonies could rise against kings, then surely women could rise against inequality. Yet even as John admired her intellect, he laughed off her warning, writing that the men knew better than to repeal our masculine systems. To him, it was jest. To her, it was prophecy. Life on the home front tested every ounce of her resolve. With her husband gone for years in Philadelphia and later in Europe, Abigail managed their farm, raised their children, and kept the family afloat through war and scarcity. She was both mother and general, tending crops by day and writing political essays by candlelight. In her letters, she chronicled the war not as an abstraction of ideals, but as a daily fight for survival, and in that fight, she discovered her own independence. Her words reached beyond her husband's desk. They captured the moral heart of the revolution that freedom was hollow if it belonged only to some. She saw, long before most, the contradiction of a nation declaring equality while enslaving others, the hypocrisy of liberty that excluded half its people. Her voice was the conscience of the revolution, whispering a truth it was not yet ready to hear. When Abigail died in 1818, her dream of equality was still unrealized. But her letters endured, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, until the world caught up to her courage. She had written not for her time, but for ours. Her words, dismissed by those who built the Republic, became its truest test. She was the voice from home, sharp, tender, relentless, and history finally learned to listen. Her words armed the mind more than any bullet. While soldiers loaded muskets and generals plotted campaigns, Mercy Otis Warren fought her battles with ink and conviction. In the age of revolution, the pen was both weapon and shield, and no one wielded it with greater fire. She was the first woman historian of the American Revolution, a playwright, essayist, and political thinker whose words stirred a generation toward independence. Yet, when the new nation was born, it forgot the woman who had helped write its soul. In the years before war, Boston was a city alive with argument coffeehouses filled with pamphlets, newspapers dripping with outrage, every printer's shop a front in the war of ideas. Mercy watched it all from her home in Plymouth, the sister of patriot James Otis and friend to John and Abigail Adams. While her husband, James Warren, served in the Massachusetts legislature, Mercy wrote from the shadows. Her satires mocked British officials and exposed corruption, her pen striking where she could not speak. Because women were forbidden from political life, her plays were published anonymously, sharp, fearless works that inflamed the cause of liberty. Her parlour became a quiet headquarters of the Revolution's intellect. Politicians and philosophers came to seek her counsel, for her mind was as sharp as any statesman's, yet she never stepped onto the public stage that her words helped shape. Behind closed doors, she wrote of freedom and tyranny, of conscience and courage, knowing full well that her own defiance was a rebellion in itself. To challenge Britain was dangerous. To challenge the idea of women's silence was heresy. Mercy did both. As the war burned on, her pen did not rest. She wrote of sacrifice and hypocrisy, of the cost of liberty and the fragility of virtue. And when peace finally came, she turned her gaze on the new nation itself. In 1790, she published History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, a sweeping account that dared to critique the very men who had led it. John Adams, once her admirer, called her work ungrateful and impertinent. Her reply was simple: truth owed loyalty to no man. The irony was cruel. The revolution that had promised liberty still feared the sound of a woman's voice. As history was written and monuments rose, Mercy's name faded from memory, her work dismissed as curiosity rather than contribution. Yet her words remained fierce, intelligent, unyielding, a record of how one woman's pen carried the spirit of rebellion across pages and generations. Her voice helped build a nation that later silenced her name, but time, patient and just, restores what pride once buried. Today, her words stand not as relics, but as reminders that the fight for freedom begins in the mind, that the truest revolution is thought itself, and that a woman with a pen can change the course of history. Where the army marched, they followed with nothing but faith and fire. While generals plotted campaigns and soldiers carried muskets, the roads behind them filled with women and children dragging wagons, carrying infants, and hauling what little they owned. They were not soldiers, yet they endured the same hunger, the same cold, the same fear. History called them camp followers, but they were far more than that. They were the lifeline of the Continental Army, the invisible hands that kept it breathing when war threatened to grind it into dust. The encampments were cities of mud and smoke. Tents flapped in the wind like ghosts. Fires burned low, their smoke mixing with the stench of sweat, sickness, and gunpowder. In the chaos, women cooked thin stews from whatever they could find, mended torn uniforms, and tended to the wounded with scraps of linen and hope. At Valley Forge, when snow buried the camp in silence, it was women who scavenged for wood, boiled snow for water, and prayed that spring would come before starvation did. They were wives, widows, daughters, some following husbands, others following the only home they had left. War had no mercy for them. They faced harassment, disease, and death as readily as any man. Babies were born in tents beside muskets and cannonballs. Some buried their children in shallow graves near the picket lines, then rose at dawn to wash soldiers' clothes or carry water to the front. They were not paid, barely fed, and often despised by officers who saw them as burdens. Yet when the army's morale broke, it was these women who held the ranks together, not with orders, but with endurance. There were moments of unexpected heroism. At Monmouth, when the guns grew hot and men fell from exhaustion, a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes, known later as Molly Pitcher, took her husband's place at the cannon, ramming home charges under enemy fire. Others carried messages through enemy lines, disguised themselves as men, or fought to defend the wagons that carried their lives. They did not fight for glory. They fought because love and survival gave them no other choice. When victory finally came, few remembered their names. They returned to ruined farms and empty homes, their contributions erased by the same patriots they had sustained. Yet without them, the revolution might have withered in its own hunger and despair. The soldiers' endurance was built on the quiet sacrifices of those who had no uniform, no rank, and no promise of reward. They were the army behind the army, an army of resilience, of mothers and daughters who carried a nation on their backs through mud and misery. Their strength was not celebrated in song or statue, but it lived on in the very idea of America, that freedom is not only won by those who fight, but by those who endure. The revolution marched on their courage, and the world never saw them fall behind. They dressed as men to fight for a freedom that wasn't theirs. In a war that proclaimed liberty but confined it to men, a few women defied both armies and convention. By doing the unthinkable, they took up arms themselves. Disguised beneath rough uniforms and false names, they marched, drilled, and bled beside soldiers who never suspected. Their courage was not only defiance of empire but rebellion against the world that told them what they could never be. The battlefield was a place no woman was meant to stand. The air thick with smoke and screams, the earth slick with mud and blood. It was a man's domain, or so the world believed. But Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts refused to believe it. Born into poverty, she grew up working the fields and sharpening her resolve against hardship. When the revolution called, she bound her chest, cut her hair, and enlisted under the name Robert Shirtliff in 1782. For nearly 2 years, she fought in the Continental Army, surviving disease, musket fire, and the constant terror of discovery. Her deception was more than disguise, it was survival. Deborah drilled with her unit, slept in the dirt, and fought in skirmishes that left many dead beside her. Once, wounded by a musket ball to the thigh, she dug it out herself with a knife, rather than let a surgeon expose her secret. She endured hunger, exhaustion, and suspicion, and still she fought on, earning the respect of her comrades not as a woman, but as a soldier. When she was finally discovered, it was not disgrace that followed, but awe. George Washington himself approved her honorable discharge. She was not alone. Dozens of women, perhaps hundreds, hid behind false names and borrowed uniforms, their identities lost to history's silence. Some fought disguised as brothers or husbands, some joined out of love, others out of conviction that liberty must mean more than words on parchment. They carried muskets beside men who would never have believed them capable of such courage, and in the end, many were buried without their truth ever known. The revolution they fought for did not reward them. After the war, Deborah returned to obscurity, her heroism forgotten, until she petitioned Congress for a soldier's pension, the first woman in American history to do so. Even then, the government hesitated, unsure whether to honor or erase her. Yet her story, and the stories like hers, lived on in whispers, in letters, in the unspoken legacy of those who refused to be confined by their time. Their bravery challenged the limits of gender long before their country dared to. They fought for a freedom that denied them, proving that courage needs no permission. The musket they carried and the secret they kept became symbols of a truth that outlived them. Liberty is not granted, it is claimed, and in claiming it, these women became soldiers not just in war, but in history's long, unfinished revolution. When her husband fell, she stepped up to the gun. On a blistering June day in 1778, at the Battle of Monmouth, the sun was as merciless as the British cannon fire. The air shimmered with heat, the fields thick with smoke and chaos. Soldiers collapsed from exhaustion beside their weapons. Muskets fell silent from lack of powder. And amid the thunder and confusion, a woman stepped forward. She was no officer, no trained fighter, just a wife who refused to run. History would remember her name as Molly Pitcher. She had come to the battlefield as many women did, following the army to carry water for the men and tend to the wounded. They called her Molly, a nickname for every woman who worked the camps, and Pitcher for the buckets she carried through the fire. That morning, she had brought water to the sweltering soldiers, pouring it into their mouths and over their burning heads. When her husband, a gunner, fell wounded beside his cannon, she did not scream or flee. She took his place, rammed the next charge home, and fired. Witnesses swore they saw her standing at the cannon through the worst of the fight, her dress torn, her skin blackened with soot. The British cannonballs tore the ground around her, but she did not waver. One even passed between her legs and ripped her skirt, to which she reportedly muttered, Well, that could have been worse. Whether she spoke those words or not, they captured her spirit, the grit and humour that turned ordinary survival into legend. When the smoke cleared and the field fell silent, General Washington is said to have recognized her bravery himself. Whether the details are truth or myth, the story of Molly Pitcher spread like wildfire through the colonies. She became a symbol of defiance, the embodiment of a nation discovering its own audacity. In her, America saw what it wanted to believe about its women, that they were as unbreakable as the ideals they fought for. Historians now believe Molly Pitcher may have been more than one woman, a composite of many camp followers who carried water, loaded cannons, and saved lives that day. Names like Mary Ludwig Hayes and Margaret Corbin emerge from the haze, real women whose courage inspired the myth. But perhaps that is the point. She was never meant to be just one person. Molly Pitcher was every woman who refused to stay behind, every wife who turned fear into defiance when history demanded it. Truth or legend, her story captured what America most wanted to believe about itself, that courage knows no rank, that heroism can wear a skirt as easily as a uniform. Molly Pitcher's canon still echoes across centuries, not just as a symbol of one woman's bravery, but as a reminder that freedom's fire was fed by many unseen hands and one unyielding spirit that refused to step aside. They carried secrets in hems, baskets, and coded words. While soldiers clashed on open fields, another war was being fought in whispers and shadows, one waged by women who had no uniforms, no weapons, and no hope of recognition. They moved unseen through occupied towns and enemy camps, their lives hanging on every glance, every sealed letter, every word spoken too loudly. The revolution depended on them, yet history nearly erased them. When the British occupied New York in 1776, the city became the heart of espionage. Armies could fight for land, but wars were won with information, troop movements, supply routes, secret plans. And in that dangerous trade, women were often the perfect spies. The enemy saw them as harmless, invisible, beneath suspicion. They turned that blindness into power. Under the pretense of selling eggs or mending clothes, they crossed checkpoints, listened to careless officers, and carried coded messages sewn into their garments or hidden in baskets of bread. Among them was the mysterious Agent 355, a woman whose name remains lost, her courage immortalized only in fragments. She worked within the British ranks, gathering intelligence for the Culper spy ring, a network that fed Washington vital information from behind enemy lines. Some say she was a socialite, others a servant. Whoever she was, she risked everything each time she passed a note or met a courier. Captured near the end of the war, she is believed to have died in a prison ship, her identity buried with her. History remembered her only by her number 355, as if even her name had been too dangerous to keep. In Philadelphia and Boston, other women played their parts. Lydia Darragh overheard British officers planning an attack while they met in her own home. Pretending to fetch flour, she slipped through the city's gates and walked miles through the snow to warn Washington's army. In Connecticut, Anna Strong used the simplest code of all hanging laundry on a clothesline to signal the movements of enemy ships. A black petticoat meant a meeting. A white handkerchief revealed the cove. The Revolution's greatest secrets hung, quite literally, in the wind. Each act of espionage carried the risk of torture, imprisonment, or death. These women could never claim their deeds, never speak of what they'd done. They lived and died as ordinary wives and mothers, their heroism hidden between the lines of their daily lives. Their silence was their protection and their punishment. They fought wars no one would ever acknowledge and won them. Their courage saved armies, their secrecy shaped victory, and their anonymity became their legacy. The revolution's success depended not just on the courage of men in uniform, but on the quiet defiance of women who moved unseen, whose battlefield was the parlor, the marketplace, and the space between suspicion and survival. Freedom's story was written in invisible ink, and women's hands held the pen. For them, the revolution was not freedom, it was survival. While colonists declared their independence and kings plotted to reclaim it, native nations faced a war that was never theirs to choose. The conflict tore through their lands like wildfire, forcing them to pick sides in a struggle that cared little for their fate. The revolution promised liberty for some, but for the women of America's first peoples, it marked the beginning of a new kind of captivity. Across the frontier, the war fractured tribes that had survived for centuries. The Iroquois Confederacy, once bound by unity, split apart, some siding with the British, others with the Americans, all desperate to protect what remained of their world. The Cherokee fought to defend their homelands, only to see their villages burned and their fields salted. For native women, the violence was not distant thunder, it was the sound of everything they knew being torn away. They were the backbone of their nations, planters, healers, diplomats, and sometimes warriors. When their husbands and sons went to fight, they tended crops in fields, scarred by battle. When the soldiers came, they gathered their children and fled into forests that no longer offered safety. Many became refugees in their own homelands, walking miles through winter snows with babies on their backs and the smoke of their villages still rising behind them. Some chose to fight. Women like Nancy Ward, a Cherokee leader known as Beloved Woman, used her voice to warn of coming raids and to plead for peace between nations. She had seen enough blood to know what the colonists' victory would bring, and she was right. Even as the revolution ended, the treaties that followed carved away native lands piece by piece. Those who had sided with the British were branded enemies. Those who had sided with the Americans were betrayed by the very nation they had helped to build. For native women, survival became both burden and rebellion. They rebuilt homes in exile, taught languages forbidden by missionaries, and kept the stories of their people alive when the world tried to silence them. Their strength became an act of resistance, the quiet endurance of a people who refused to vanish, even as their world was erased from the map. Their courage endured long after the revolution's flags came down. They were witnesses to the first betrayal and the last defenders of memory. The war that gave birth to a new nation also began the centuries-long struggle of those who had lived here first. Yet through loss and exile, native women carried the heartbeat of their nations forward. History called it freedom. For them, it was survival, and survival, against all odds, became its own kind of victory. They fought for liberty and were left in chains. While the colonies cried out for freedom from a king, thousands of enslaved women listened from the shadows, knowing the words, "All men are created equal," were never meant for them. The revolution promised liberty, yet for black women it brought only new masters, new sorrows, and the bitter truth that independence could be won without justice. Their fight was not for a flag or a nation, but for the right to be seen as human in a world built to forget them. The war split their lives in two. Some fled to British lines, drawn by the promise of freedom offered by royal proclamations. They cooked for soldiers, carried messages, and cared for the wounded, all in the hope that the empire that had once enslaved them might now deliver them. Others remained with their patriot masters, forced to labor even as those men spoke of liberty and tyranny in the same breath. The revolution was a war of words for some, but for black women it was a war of survival, a battle fought in kitchens, fields, and the back-breaking silence of bondage. Among them was Phyllis Wheatley, a young enslaved woman in Boston whose genius broke through her captivity. Taught to read by her enslavers, she devoured the classics and found her voice in poetry. Her verses praised the revolution's ideals, even as they exposed its hypocrisy. "In every human breast, God has implanted a principle," she wrote, "love of freedom." She sent her poems to George Washington himself, who praised her talent but not her plea. The world admired her words, but few heard the truth within them, that liberty without equality was only a prettier kind of bondage. Others resisted in quieter ways. They smuggled messages between camps, hid runaways, or simply refused to obey. Some joined the British evacuation after the war, sailing for Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone, leaving behind the land that had stolen their names but never their will. Many more were left behind, re-enslaved by the new republic that claimed to have been born in freedom. For them, independence changed nothing. the revolution's victory only redrew the lines of their oppression. Yet even in that betrayal, their strength endured. They built families torn apart by sale, held faith in the face of cruelty, and passed on songs of hope that would one day fuel another kind of revolution, one fought not with muskets, but with voices and courage. Their survival became prophecy, a promise that the ideals men had spoken but never fulfilled would one day belong to them too. Their stories expose the revolution's deepest hypocrisy and its unfinished work. Freedom, they proved, is not declared, it is demanded, generation after generation. The revolution gave America its language of liberty, but it was black women who gave it meaning through pain, through poetry, and through the unbreakable belief that one day those words would finally include them. They had no rank, but they saved an army. While generals mapped their victories and soldiers won their glory in smoke and blood, women knelt beside the dying in silence. Their battlefields were not the front lines but the fever tents and the barnyard hospitals where men groaned in agony and death hung thick in the air. They were nurses, caretakers, and healers, the ones who fought not to destroy, but to save. Without them, the revolution would have bled out long before freedom was won. The army's hospitals were barely worthy of the name. Canvas stretched over broken beams, straw laid down for beds, and the stench of rot clinging to everything. Supplies were scarce, medicines scarcer still. Surgeons sawed through limbs with dull blades, and infection claimed more soldiers than bullets ever could. Into that horror stepped women who had never been trained for war wives, widows, and mothers who refused to turn away. They scrubbed wounds, burned linens, and prayed that their hands could hold back death for one more hour. In every camp, they were there nameless, tireless, enduring what most men could not. They boiled water when there was no clean source, fed broth to the fevered, and closed the eyes of those they could not save. They caught smallpox, typhus, and dysentery, and kept working until they fell ill themselves. Their reward was little more than a soldier's rations and a commander's disdain. Many officers dismissed them as nuisances, yet when the wounded piled too high, they came begging for their help. Some names survived the tide of time. Mary Waters tended hundreds of wounded after the Battle of Germantown. Catherine Moore Barry carried supplies and messages through British lines. Her home turned into a makeshift infirmary. But for every woman remembered, 100 more remain unknown, their graves unmarked, their work unrecorded, their courage unmeasured. Their battlefield was quieter, but no less brutal. They faced not the fear of musket fire, but the slow, relentless cruelty of suffering. They saw every kind of wound, limbs mangled by cannon fire, faces scarred beyond recognition, boys crying for mothers who would never come. And still they stayed. Their strength was not in their bodies, but in their resolve, in the simple, stubborn belief that even amid carnage, compassion mattered. Where the revolution tore men apart, these women stitched the fragments back together. Their compassion became the quiet heartbeat of a war built on pain. They received no medals, no titles, and yet their service was the truest kind of valor, the courage to care when everything around them called for vengeance. In their hands, the revolution found its humanity. And though history rarely speaks their names, the freedom they helped preserve still carries the echo of their kindness, steady and unbroken beneath the roar of victory. While men fought the British, women fought hunger. The revolution may have been waged with muskets and drums, but its survival depended on quieter battles, those fought in kitchens, fields, and barns across the colonies. When husbands and sons marched away, women stayed behind to face an enemy that never retreated. The slow, grinding struggle of keeping life alive amid absence and uncertainty. Theirs was a war without banners, and yet it demanded every ounce of bravery the battlefield ever did. The countryside was hollowed out by war. With men gone to fight, farms lay untended, tools rusted, and fields overrun with weeds. British raids burned harvests, and shortages drove food prices sky high. Into that void stepped the women ploughing, planting, and reaping with hands blistered and backs bent from dawn to dusk. They tended livestock, repaired fences, and bartered what little they had to keep children fed. Every loaf of bread, Every candle lit in the dark was an act of quiet defiance against chaos. In towns and villages, the women's burdens were no lighter. They organized relief efforts for soldiers, collected supplies, and mended uniforms by the light of dwindling fires. Letters from the front came rarely, if at all, and when they did, they carried both hope and heartbreak. A wife might read that her husband had survived a battle, only to learn that he would not be coming home. Still, she rose the next morning to milk the cows, fetch water, and teach her children that the fight for freedom was worth their hunger. For many, the war brought ruin. British soldiers looted homes, took livestock, and left nothing but ashes behind. In occupied cities like New York and Philadelphia, women walked a razor's edge between loyalty and survival, feigning neutrality just to live another day. Some lost everything, husbands, sons, land, and yet refused to yield. They learned to measure victory not in battles won, but in the simple fact that their families endured. The daughters grew up fast. They learned to spin, to plant, to defend what was theirs. They became the next generation of resilience, shaped by the lessons their mothers had carved out of hardship. When the revolution ended, it was these women who rebuilt, who restored farms, reopened shops, and stitched the torn fabric of their communities back together. They were the foundation upon which the new nation would stand. They proved that courage didn't always wear a uniform. It could wear an apron, a shawl, or the callouses of labor. The revolution was won not only by the men who fought, but by the women who endured, who turned despair into determination and survival into victory. Their battlefield was the home front, their weapon endurance, and their victory the simple, stubborn act of keeping hope alive. She ran through fire with freedom in her hands. In the autumn of 1782, as the revolution gasped toward its end, one final battle flared on the western frontier, the siege of Fort Henry. It was a small wooden outpost on the edge of the Ohio Valley, far from the grand armies and famous generals of history. Yet there, amid the smoke and gunfire, a young woman named Betty Zane performed an act of courage so extraordinary it should have echoed through the centuries. Instead, it nearly vanished, like so many stories of the women who saved a nation. Fort Henry was under siege by British loyalists and their native allies, its defenders hopelessly outnumbered. The gunfire was constant, the air thick with the smell of powder and fear. Inside the fort, the men fired round after round until one grim truth became clear: the powder was gone. Without it, they would fall within the hour. The only supply left was in a cabin outside the walls, across an open field already crawling with enemy fire. To fetch it was suicide. Betty Zane stepped forward. Barely 16, she refused to watch her home burn and her family die. She stripped down to her linen shift, white against the dark smoke so her skirts would not catch flame, and sprinted through the gate before anyone could stop her. Muskets cracked, bullets whipped past her, but she did not slow. Reaching the cabin, she filled her apron with gunpowder and turned back, the weight of the revolution's last hope pressing against her chest. The run back was worse. Every rifle in the field aimed at the streak of white darting through the chaos. Smoke stung her eyes, the ground shook with cannon fire, and the air burned with heat. Yet she made it stumbling through the gate, her apron still full, her breath ragged but unbroken. With the powder she carried, the defenders held the fort. The siege failed. The war, already dying in the east, flickered one last time before finally falling silent. When it was over, Betty Zane's name barely appeared in the records. The men who fought wrote of valor and victory, but her act was dismissed as legend, her bravery folded into myth. Years later, her story resurfaced only because her descendants refused to let her fade. They remembered that in a war fought by thousands, one young woman's courage had saved them all. One act of courage that history almost let burn away, but courage like hers does not die. Betty Zane's run through fire was more than a tale of heroism. It was a glimpse of the quiet strength that built America, one heartbeat at a time. She proved that bravery needs no uniform, no rank, no permission, only conviction. And though her name was nearly lost to the smoke of time, her spirit still runs, fearless and unforgotten, across the fields of history. Not every woman cheered for independence. While crowds in Boston and Philadelphia shouted for liberty, others watched in silence, loyal not to rebellion, but to the king across the sea. For them, the revolution was not a cause, but a catastrophe. They saw not freedom, but chaos, not destiny, but destruction. They were loyalist women, wives, mothers, and daughters who stood by their convictions even as their neighbors branded them traitors. History wrote them out of the story, but their struggle was as fierce and their suffering as real as any patriots. When the colonies split in two, so did families. Husbands joined opposing sides, sons fought each other in the same fields where they'd once worked together. In cities under British control, loyalist women opened their homes to soldiers, provided supplies, or nursed the wounded acts of devotion that made them outcasts once the British retreated. In patriot towns, they faced mobs that tore down their houses, burned their belongings, and drove them from their communities. Some were imprisoned. Others were forced to flee with only what they could carry, their loyalty paid for in exile and grief. They followed the Redcoats when the war turned against them, boarding crowded ships to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or back to England. The voyage was brutal, the welcome colder still. Many had left behind everything they owned, their land confiscated, their friends gone, their names reviled. The British Crown promised them protection, but gave them only distance. They became ghosts between nations, too American for England, too loyal for America. Among them were women like Mary Brant, a Mohawk leader who supported the British cause to protect her people's lands, and Elizabeth Murray, a Boston merchant who fought to keep her business alive in a city that saw her as the enemy. They were not villains. They were women trapped between loyalties to family, to country, to conscience. They watched as the world they knew collapsed, and still they endured, clinging to dignity when the revolution offered them none. After the war, America celebrated its patriots and forgot its loyalists. Their stories disappeared, their descendants forced to bury their allegiance in silence. Yet their lives remind us that liberty was never a single story, that for every victory, someone paid the price of loss. Freedom, in all its triumph, came with shadows that stretched across oceans. Their silence reminds us that freedom is not the same for everyone. The loyalist women did not fight for glory or reward. They held to their beliefs even as history turned against them. In their steadfastness lies a different kind of courage, the strength to remain true when the world demands betrayal. Their voices may have been forgotten, but their endurance remains a quiet testament to the revolution's other truth, that independence, no matter how noble, always leaves someone behind. When the guns went silent, their war began. The treaties were signed, the armies disbanded, and the new nation celebrated its freedom, but for thousands of women, the revolution never truly ended. The smoke cleared to reveal empty doorways, unplanted fields, and graves marked only by memory. The men had fought for liberty, the women were left to live with its cost. Across the colonies, widows filled the roads and the poorhouses. They came with children in their arms and hope worn thin. The pensions promised to them were meager, if they came at all. Paperwork vanished, names were misspelled, and the government that had been born from sacrifice quickly forgot those who had paid the heaviest price. Many took in washing, mended clothes, or worked the soil themselves, their hands blistered and bleeding where their husbands once stood. Their homes were rebuilt not with timber, but with endurance. Some stories shone through the hardship. Lucy Knox, wife of General Henry Knox, returned to a life of quiet dignity, but never forgot the friends she had buried. Rachel Revere held her family together through debt and danger, while her husband, Paul, rode into legend. And then there were the countless others, nameless women who never remarried, who raised sons to be citizens of a country their fathers had died to create. They were the first true caretakers of the Republic, stitching its future from loss. The orphans, too, carried the weight of freedom. They grew up in households where stories of heroism mingled with hunger, where the revolution was both a source of pride and a wound that never healed. For them, independence was not fireworks or parades. It was a mother's tired smile as she scraped together another meal, a reminder that liberty's price was measured in empty chairs at the table. And yet, from the wreckage, something extraordinary emerged. These women, weary, uncelebrated, and often forgotten, built the peace that soldiers only dreamed of. They restored farms, reopened shops, and rebuilt faith in the promise of a country still learning how to stand. They taught their children that freedom was not a gift handed down from generals, but a duty carried forward in the smallest acts of courage. Their resilience built the peace the soldiers only dreamed of. The revolution ended with cannons and speeches, but its true victory was born in kitchens and fields, in homes where women chose to live on, when despair said they could not. They buried the war and raised a nation in its place. History may have crowned heroes, but it was the widows and survivors who gave America its heart steady, scarred, and still beating. They took the revolution from the battlefield to the classroom. When the muskets cooled and the Constitution was written, the war for liberty entered a new arena, the mind. The nation was newborn, fragile, and uneducated, its future resting not only on laws but on learning. Into that silence stepped women who had once been dismissed as caretakers. Now they became teachers, the quiet architects of a republic, still learning what freedom truly meant. In small towns and farmhouses, they opened their doors and called them schools. A few benches, a slate, a Bible, maybe a borrowed primer that was enough. They taught children their letters, their numbers, and, without meaning to, their country's conscience. They believed that liberty could not survive in ignorance, that democracy required wisdom as much as courage. In their lessons on reading and virtue, they planted the idea that the republic belonged not just to the powerful, but to those who could think for themselves. Women like Emma Willard, Judith Sargent Murray, and later Catherine Beecher carried that torch. They argued that if the new nation expected its citizens to govern themselves, it must educate its mothers, for it was mothers who shaped the next generation's minds. This became the creed of Republican motherhood, a radical idea cloaked in modesty, that a woman's duty to her family gave her the right to knowledge. It was both a restriction and a revolution, turning the home into the first classroom of American democracy. Their work was not easy. Many communities resisted, believing women had no place in formal education. Yet these teachers persisted, their chalk-stained hands rewriting the nation's future one child at a time. They walked miles through snow to reach students, taught by candlelight, and kept lessons alive through war, disease, and poverty. In an age when women still could not vote, they built the intellectual foundation of the world that one day would. They taught not only reading and writing, but empathy, civility, and conscience lessons the revolution had failed to master. They reminded children that freedom was more than defiance. It was discipline, understanding, and compassion. And through them, the ideals once shouted on battlefields began to take root in hearts and minds. They taught freedom before the nation was ready to practice it. These women were not generals or founders, yet their influence reached further than any decree or battle plan. They turned knowledge into nationhood and gave the republic its most powerful weapon, an educated people. In every lesson, in every child they taught, they carried the revolution forward not in gunfire, but in words, patience, and the unshakable belief that liberty, to live, must first be learned. The revolution promised equality, then erased their names. When the war ended and the republic was born, the same voices that had cried for liberty grew quiet when it came to women. The drums of independence had faded, replaced by the sound of pens scratching out laws written by men for men. The very women who had stitched uniforms, risked lives, and shaped ideals found themselves pushed back into silence. The revolution that had flung open the doors of possibility now closed them again softly, deliberately. In the new Congress halls and state assemblies, no woman's voice was heard. The founders spoke of rights endowed by the Creator, yet they wrote a constitution that never once mentioned their mothers, wives, or daughters. The world Abigail Adams had dreamed of one, where men would remember the ladies never came to pass. From her home in Quincy, she watched the republic grow into what she and John had once imagined together, but she knew it was a nation still half built. Liberty had been won, but justice remained unfinished. Mercy Otis Warren felt the same betrayal. Her pen, once celebrated for inspiring rebellion, now made her a curiosity in a country that preferred its women quiet. Her history of the American Revolution, bold and unflinching, was dismissed by many of the very men it immortalized. Too sharp, they said. Too opinionated. They wanted her gratitude, not her judgment. She had written the truth that power, even in the hands of patriots, still feared the sound of a woman's mind. This silence was not an accident, it was a policy. Newspapers that once printed women's letters of protest now ignored them. Schools taught girls to read but not to think too loudly. Laws denied women property, inheritance, or the vote, ensuring their dependence on the men who claimed to speak for them. They had carried the revolution on their backs, and now they were expected to disappear beneath its weight. But silence, though imposed, is never empty. It holds memory, defiance, and waiting. The women of the revolution did not vanish. They endured. They told their daughters stories of courage and hypocrisy, of men who spoke of freedom while fearing equality. Those daughters would grow into the women who one day demanded suffrage, education, and voice. The promise of the revolution had not died, it had merely gone underground, gathering strength in every unheard heart. The revolution freed a nation but caged its women. It built a republic on the language of liberty while teaching half its people to remain unseen. Yet history, with time, began to listen again. The silence they endured became the soil from which future revolutions would grow, not with muskets or cannon fire, but with pens, protests, and the unwavering belief that freedom, once spoken, can never be unlearned. They refused to be written out. When the revolution ended and the new nation began to shape its myth, women's names were the first to vanish from the story. Their sacrifices faded behind the glow of founding fathers and battlefield heroes. But in attics and trunks, in fragile journals and folded letters, another history survived, written by the women who had lived it. They were not historians, but witnesses, determined that the truth of their struggle would not die in silence. In cramped handwriting and fading ink, they told the story no monument ever could. They wrote of hunger and fear, of sons lost and homes burned, of courage that came not from glory but from necessity. Their diaries captured the heartbeat of a nation being born not in declarations, but in the day-to-day endurance of those who held it together. One widow recorded how she melted down her pewter dishes to make bullets. Another wrote by candlelight about feeding soldiers with her last loaf of bread. These were not tales for fame, they were acts of remembrance, defiance against forgetting. Letters, too, became lifelines of truth. Abigail Adams wrote of politics and principle, her words outlasting the generations that ignored them. Mercy Otis Warren chronicled not only battles, but the moral cost of victory. Other women, known only by initials or given names, filled pages that no one ever meant to publish notes of love, lament, and survival. Each letter was a fragment of the revolution's real face, a piece of humanity preserved against the tide of myth. Some, like Martha Washington, tried to erase their own past. Before her death, she burned nearly every letter from George, perhaps fearing that the world would pry too deeply into a life already burdened by legend. Others hid their words out of modesty or fear. Yet enough survived, tucked away in Bibles, pressed between pages of family histories to tell us what official records never did. That the revolution was fought as much in heartbreak as in heroism. Their writing gave the war a conscience. It reminded the future that freedom was not forged by declarations alone, but by the hands and hearts of those who endured it in silence. Without these women, the revolution's memory would have been hollow, all triumph and no truth. Their words made history human again, filling in the spaces between the statues. History owes its memory to those who refused to stay silent. They could not vote, command, or legislate, but they could write, and in doing so, they saved what the world tried to forget. Their diaries and letters are the nation's true monuments. Ink instead of marble, honesty instead of grandeur. They remembered, so that we would too, that freedom once lived, must always be written down to survive. They didn't win equality, they planted it. The women of the revolution did not see the world they deserved, but they built the one that made it possible. Out of their courage, endurance, and words grew a quiet inheritance, a belief that liberty must include every voice. They may not have written the laws of the new nation, but they wrote its conscience. And though their victories were small and scattered, they were seeds planted deep in the soil of a country still learning what freedom meant. In the decades after the war, the republic they had fought to sustain forgot them. The same society that had depended on their labor and intellect now shut them out of its promise. Yet their stories did not fade. They were told in kitchens and parlors, in whispered pride from mothers to daughters, in the margins of old family Bibles, and in the lessons taught at schoolhouse desks. A generation raised by the women of the revolution would grow to ask a question their fathers never had. If freedom is God-given, why is it denied to half of his creation? Their spirit echoed in the next great struggle. When women gathered at Seneca Falls in 1848 to demand their rights, they drew directly from the words and example of those who came before. Elizabeth Cady Stanton grew up hearing tales of revolutionary sacrifice. Lucretia Mott carried the moral fire of the Daughters of Liberty. Even Sojourner Truth, once enslaved in a nation that called itself free, embodied the defiance of every woman who had endured the revolution's broken promise. The torch had passed not in ceremony, but in memory. The link between those two revolutions, the war for independence and the struggle for equality, was not political, but human. The courage to defy kings became the courage to defy men. The demand for representation became the demand for recognition. The ideals that had been too dangerous to speak in 1776 became unignorable by 1848. What began as whispers in the shadows of the revolution grew into a roar that would one day shake the foundations of the republic itself. They did not live to see equality blossom, but they tended its roots. Their toil, their grief, their ink-stained hands shaped a world that would one day make room for their daughters' voices. The revolution ended with independence, but it was the women who ensured that its promise would not end there. From the revolution's ashes grew the roots of another, the fight for equality. What the women of the 18th century began in silence, the women of the 19th would shout into history. Freedom, once sparked, cannot be contained. And though they never stood beneath the banners of victory, those first women of the revolution lit the torch that still burns steady, defiant, and passed from hand to hand across the centuries. The revolution never ended, it just changed hands. Its battlefields shifted from muddy fields to meeting halls, from gunsmoke to petitions, from the thunder of cannons to the steady, unstoppable murmur of women refusing to be forgotten. The war for freedom did not stop when the treaties were signed. It lived on in every woman who believed the promise of liberty was still unfinished. Their fight was quieter, but it stretched further across centuries, across generations, across every place where freedom was spoken but not yet shared. From the campfires of Valley Forge to the parlors of Seneca Falls, one unbroken thread runs through America's story, a thread spun by women's hands. The camp women who nursed soldiers in rags, the mothers who tilled the soil while the men went to war, the poets and teachers who turned courage into knowledge, they passed that thread to the suffragists who stood in the streets 100 years later, demanding the vote that their grandmothers had been denied. And those suffragists, in turn, passed it to us, to every voice that still insists on justice, on recognition, on truth. The women who came before us did not wait for permission. They took the ideals of the revolution, freedom, equality, self-determination, and made them their own, even when the world said they could not. They did it with words, with labor, with patience that outlasted empires. Theirs was not a legacy of conquest, but of creation, building, teaching, mending, remembering. They carried the weight of liberty when the men who had declared it had long laid down their arms. Through their endurance, they defined what it truly meant to be American. They showed that freedom is not a gift handed down by the powerful, but a torch carried by the persistent. They proved that revolutions are not one-time events, but living struggles, reborn in every generation that refuses to forget. In their silence, they taught resilience, In their invisibility, they revealed strength, and in their memory, we find the truest measure of the revolution's soul. Their names may have faded, their stories scattered like ash in the wind, but their legacy is written in everything this country became and everything it still strives to be. Every right we claim, every barrier we break, stands on the ground they cleared with bare hands and boundless faith. They were the architects of endurance, the builders of hope, the keepers of the unfinished promise. The revolution's truest patriots were not those who led, but those who endured. The women who spun and sewed, who fought and taught, who wept, and still believed they were the heartbeat that kept liberty alive when its flame flickered low. Their revolution never ended, because it never truly will. As long as someone remembers, questions, and reaches for more, the spirit they kindled endures fierce, patient, and eternal.